Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Red Power Hour. I'm Melanie Yazzie, one of the co-hosts, Red Nation Comrade. We're joined by another Red Nation Comrade we haven't heard from in a while. Super excited to have you here, Levi. I'll pass it to Elena to introduce herself and to Levi, and then we'll get into our topic for today.
Sankitamu. I'm Elena Ortiz, the co host of Red Power Hour, along with Melanie. Excited to have Levi with us. I'm calling in from Ogapoge Owinge, otherwise known as Santa Fe. And yeah, glad you're following along.
Thank you. No, it's good to be back. Hamatakiapi, Levi Harter Machapelo. My name is Levi. I'm calling in from so-called Seattle, Washington, Point Elliott Treaty territory. Um, yeah, and I'm excited to be here. I always watch Red Power Hour. We were joking around because we had realized that me and Elena hadn't formally met yet. So I just feel like I don't know. I just watched the episode so much, but so I'm excited to be here.
Aw. Yeah, I feel like we all know each other, I guess, in a way. It kind of feels like that. But yeah, thanks for joining again. So I don't remember who requested. We're gonna do a movie review. We're gonna do a double header, actually. There's because these two movies that we're gonna review today on RPH because we're kind of known for doing that. I don't remember where this request came from, but we've been meaning to do this movie review for a very long time. And so we're reviewing, drum roll, Avatar, not the last Airbender, but like the James Cameron Blue Cat people avatars. So the one that came out like 16 years ago, and then the one that came out 3 years ago. Uh, I had so much hate for these movies. I cannot wait to talk about it with everyone. But I'm gonna hand it over to Levi first, because I think it's really important, as our producer Cena, our comrade Cena pointed out, to really like share the impact, like the financial impact of these films. I remember when the first one came out, it was a huge deal. Like people were obsessed with Avatar when it first came out in 2009. Um, and Levi, yeah, why don't you just read some of these stats? It's kind of staggering.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so the original Avatar came out 2009, and it is the highest grossing film of all time at 2.923 billion worldwide, so almost $3 billion. Avatar: Way of Water in 2022 grossed 2.32 billion, making it the third highest grossing film. So like the top three highest grossing films, there two of them are like they're related, they're a sequel. So and I'll just read some of these other ones. So like um the budget for Avatar in 2009 was $237 million. Running releasing on December 18th, 2009, so right around the Christmas. I remember actually because my uncle, we would always just go to movies and stuff, and he was really the first thing I can remember hearing about this movie, he's like, "Oh, we need to go see this movie." It was in 3D. 3D technology had just got started, and like the visuals, the talk about the visuals was one of the big things about the first
Yep.
one and how good it looked. And so they spent $237 million in budget on the first one. Opening weekend reeled in 77 million. Um, and then Avatar: Way of the Water releasing in 2022, also releasing December 16th, 2022. With an increased runtime, it was like a half hour longer. Both of these movies are epics. James Cameron loves an epic. And the budget was actually increased at 300. It says estimated 350 to 460 million. So I don't know if they were, I don't know why it says estimated. We don't have an exact number. But it did win the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, and Avatar: Way of Water was nominated for Best Picture.
What? Sorry. What the actual? I'm sorry.
um, yeah, and it says the Avatar franchise is the fastest to reach 3 billion, 4 billion, and 5 billion at the box office with only two films. The original Avatar holds the record for highest grossing for a 3D IMAX film. And Way of Water was the highest grossing film of 2022 and the highest grossing film since the pandemic. Um, which I kind of vaguely, yeah, it was 2022. I just saw the second one last night, so I was fully out of the loop and very intentional about not catching the blue train whenever Way of Water came around. So yeah, just
Yeah.
some fast facts.
Yeah, I'm with Mel. I like hated these movies. I saw the first one in 2009 in the theater in 3D, and the visual effects, just techno tech speaking, the technology had gone, you know, strides from when I was young and the first Star Wars movie came out, and then followed quickly by Close Encounters of the Third Kind and all the Raiders of the Lost Ark, all of that. So Avatar was like mind blowing in its um, special effects, and it was beautiful. I mean, the colors are beautiful and all of that. And it was 3 hours, and it was obvious within the first half hour, like it's going through my head, and I'm sitting in the chair, like, uh-huh. So this is us. They're talking about us. They're talking about Native people. And then it was just intense hatred, like hatred of so many things. And over the years, I've had time to think about it. And then there were Lakota, particularly activists, who came out when Way of the Water was being released and said, "Do not support this motherfucker," because um, there's a quote. I can read it. It's just to get us started. Um, it was a Navajo artist and activist who called for a boycott of the film because of remarks that James Cameron made when he was um, trying to be the white savior, not just talk about white saviors. He was helping some indigenous folks in the Amazon fight against a hydroelectric dam project. And he says, and I quote, "I felt like I was 130 years back in time watching what the Lakota Sioux might have been saying at a point when they were being pushed and they were being killed and they were being asked to displace, and they were being given some form of compensation," he said. "This was a driving force for me in the writing of Avatar. I couldn't help but think that if the Lakota Sioux, had had a time window and they could see the future and they could see their kids committing suicide at the highest suicide rates in the nation because they were hopeless and they were a dead end society, which is what is happening now, they would have fought a lot harder."
Are you fucking kidding me?
I
He
am not.
said that?
I forgot about you. I totally forgot about that.
And so I was not aware of that when that second film came out. But when I read that, it was actually in The Guardian. I read the article in The Guardian, and I like mind blown that, first of all, here is a guy who is literally um, co-opting indigenous culture that is literally like cannibalizing um, and regurgitating native culture in a way that makes him billions and billions of dollars. But then he's victim blaming and calling out, like, really, he thinks that the Lakota should have fought harder. Um, and that kind of attitude it made me physically ill. And so I said to myself at that point, I am not going to pay to watch this movie. I did pay to see the first one. I'm not paying to see the second one. So I didn't see the second one for years and years. Well, I mean, it's only been 3 years, but I finally watched it on a long airline flight. And I was like, oh God, this is worse than the first one. It's just literally despicable. But so James Cameron is basically the epitome of toxic settler colonialism and cultural appropriation. And I mean, it's so sick. And I watched parts of it. I couldn't watch the whole one last night, the first one, but it's not just appropriation. It's like literally his characters, and that the main character, Jake Sully, it's not that he goes native like fucking Kevin Costner. He literally gets into the skin, like he becomes, like that's how sick this film is. And you know, we've talked a lot on Red Power Hour, particularly when we're talking about films, about this idea that the appropriation in many of these films, the westerns, goes all the way to like the white guys end up being better Indians than the Indians. But this is literally a step further. This isn't just going native. This is literally putting on the skin. This is like Hannibal fucking Lecter. This is putting on the skin of a native person to become this in this film. And it's really disgusting and appalling and absurd. And yeah, James Cameron, there's a special place in hell for you. That's yeah.
I forgot about that. You just uncovered a rage that I had hidden.
Same.
I remember that too, and I remember when it was coming out, everyone. I remember being one of those people who's like, "Yo, don't go see this movie," and people were like, "Why?" I'm like, "Well, first of all, it's like Dances and Wolves in Space." I said, "So we don't need to rehash this." I said, but second, I forgot about those comments. That was yeah. That we would have fought harder. And that was he said that was his inspiration. He's like, yeah, as I was creating the Navi, you know, just like it's not up to me, speaking from perspective white privilege, if you will, to tell them that they're wrong, he said of his critics. And wow, that is wild. I called Justine before this because I wanted to get her 2 cents, and she had something about the specific like fitting in the skin of it. It's like if the goal of settler colonialism is to ultimately become the native, right? Like displacement, you know, replacing. Like this is what did she? How did she put it? She said this is the settler colonial, the insatiable hunger for trying to do that. Like this is what hippies like dream of, like to physically enter a body. Um,
Hmm.
and I would like to get into the that kind of perspective a bit, but oh man, did you see the movie in theater?
Fuck no. I did. Sorry. I'm gonna drop so many F bombs during the. I'm so pissed off right now. Uh, I only went to see the first one because my brother-in-law was like super excited about the special effects, right? Because as you said, Elena and Levi, in 2009, like this was a major reason why people were so excited to see it. And I think lent to why it was so high grossing, why audiences were so excited. It was mostly like the special effects essentially were supposed to be like different than any movie that had ever come out ever in the history of movies. Um, and so that's why my brother-in-law was super excited. And we were all together because it was like Christmas time or something. And so my entire family went to go see it. I'm a 43-year-old woman. Like my entire family does not go see movies together like ever. And so this was probably the only time that had happened since I was maybe a child. Um, and I remember watching it and then coming out of it and just being like, what did I just witness? Like that felt really racist against Indigenous people. And so yes, my brother-in-law paid for those tickets. I did not pay for that ticket. But that was what 15, 16 years ago. I'm a different person than I was even then. I'm obviously more politicized. I have a stronger analysis. I got a PhD in native studies and all these things. And so when the second one came out, I was just like, I know I'm going to hate this. I am not paying to watch this. I'm going to boycott this. I didn't even know all the critiques that were happening. I just knew it was going to be bullshit. And I do remember people calling it like the water protector, one of the Avatar series, and people were kind of talking. People meaning native people were talking online about it. But yeah, I watched it last night because for the reason of recording this podcast, so I could critique it, and that's the only reason I watched it. If we had not decided to critique it, I never ever would have watched that terrible movie. Um, I also now have lost almost 6 hours of my life to James Cameron's like circle jerk and his desire to like his weird like settler colonial get out fantasy of, like living inside the skins of indigenous people. And this is the thing about Avatar. Like Avatar, it's interesting to hear him say that he was inspired by the Lakota because obviously like I rewatched 2/3 of the first Avatar. I didn't get through it. I don't ever want to watch it ever again. Um, Before we recorded this morning, actually, I watched part of it this morning, and I forgot that there was like the warriors, like the Navi warriors who come in on the horses, and like the way they were like lilying and stuff like that felt so just so straightforwardly Lakota. But also in the second one, The Way of Water, they're like in the caves, in the mountains. And it was so Geronimo. It was just straightforward Geronimo shit. And so, but then also the jewelry that they're wearing, and even like the way that the voice actors who play who voice over like the different characters have like sometimes like Caribbean or like African accents. I forgot that Wes Studi was the voice for the chief in the first Avatar. And I was like, I forgot about this shit. And so I can't, yes, I completely forgot. And when I heard his voice, I was like, that's Wes Studi. Because I hadn't watched that movie in 16 years before this morning when I was trying to rewatch some of it to prepare for this podcast episode. And so it's interesting that James Cameron is like saying all this dumb shit about Lakota people and how they were the inspiration, because Avatar is just like a racist amalgamation of what he thinks indigenous people are. There were scenes of like the conquest and the resource colonialism that was also like straight out of Vietnam, like the helicopters dropping soldiers into the jungles and into the fields. Like it was so derivative in that sense. It was literally just, and it's so, you had talked about this earlier, Levi, and before we started recording, about the ethnomusicology, and like what he wanted for the first movie. But the fact that he like went all around the world to try to get like all of the sounds that would make it feel like alien but also indigenous. I mean, that really, like, the Na'vi are literally just that. They're just this like fucked up amalgamation of indigenous people that he just appropriated from like indigenous people from all over the world. And then it was just like a weird mashup into like blue cat people. And I found it incredibly disgusting. So I don't even know why he was talking so specifically about the Lakota, because that was one piece of it, but I found it to be a weird, creepy indigenous hybrid of multiple kinds. But so many things. You asked me a question, and I went in a completely different direction, but yes, I watched it. Not by choice. Did not want to give this my money. We're trying to be here to do a service for the people and trying to provide a very overdue strong indigenous critique of this nonsense, because it's very powerful. If it's the first and the third highest grossing film of all time, that means it has a very powerful narrative. We all know the world of cultural production, especially pop culture, there's immense power. Like there's a battleground of ideas that plays out in that sphere. And it's like incredibly important, I think, to see these kinds of things clearly so that they don't just like normalize and reproduce and just like naturalize settler colonialism, because I think we can all agree that that's really all that these movies are about. And that the ending of the second movie foreshadows a third movie. Obviously, there's at least a third movie.
There's
What
five.
are you? What?
In the works? Yes, there's a deal for 5, and it comes out this year. Yeah.
No.
So, and you want to get the kicker too. So so there was a lot in that, but James Cameron, first of all, he created this fictitious native people that he intentionally wanted to be unrecognizable. He wanted them to be unrecognizable to Western audiences, right? And he didn't say that explicitly, but we can assume that's his demographic and his target, right? So he went around the world gathering music from tribal peoples in Northeast India. He looked at music from Chinese and Vietnamese working class people, not performance songs, right? Because like some people, Western people, they make music to perform it, right? They make music to perform, to be on stage, to make a spectacle. Peoples around the world outside the Western spheres of influence and in the global South, we have music just because, just working songs, morning songs, prayer songs, like music that reflects a lived life. So he created this fictitious alien indigenous people, um, and then literally colonized it. And like, so the video that I watched is why Avatar has the most ironic soundtrack of all time. And I think it is timely because, like, at the same time, I was like, man, I was like, why are we watching this like in 2025? Like, like these movies came out so long ago, but the next movie that is coming out is called Avatar Fire and Ash. And supposedly, I've seen very little and I've done very little intentional looking into it, but it's supposed to be uh, about like the darker side of the Na'vi. So they're going to explore like, oh, like you think all Na'vi are at one with the earth and literally biologically and genetically intertwined, like mystical Indian type, like, because the idea of the mystical Indian, that we are inherently different, or indigenous peoples are inherently more connected to Mother Earth, and the romanticism and mysticism that made it into the movie by the way that he biologically has them a part of like Awa, or a part of the Earth. Like at the opening of the second Avatar, the Sigourney Weaver's like, also the Immaculate Conception baby. She's listening to Sigourney Weaver's audio cast, and she's like, I'm hesitant to call it intelligence. Um, this is more of like an awareness, like an aware, living, breathing ecosystem of consciousness. Um, and he connected these people to, like, they literally embody the idea of a mystical Indian, of like us being supernaturally, or that we have some sort of different racial kind of categorization that makes us more in touch with nature, or something like that. um, but anyways, the third movie is supposed to be about like this darker side of the Navi, right? So that, and I don't know what that means, but based on the way the movie ends, I'm like, I'm calling it right now. They're going to play like Lakota scouts, like with Custer's army. They're going to have like, these are the Navi who are like siding with, and it's just all derivative. Like that, those were actually the biggest criticisms of these movies when they came out at the time too. Like, and it's kind of sad that everyone went for the technical aspects, um, just to see a beautifully, technically beautiful movie. But the storyline is so derivative. It's just, I just kept thinking, I'm like, God damn, like, what if, James Cameron would have just like stepped back, gave his money up, and let like Indians.
Right?
It's also, I think, it is very derivative, and it's very, it creates this um, sort of mystique of the pan indigenous, like you said, the all of the, like, we're all connected to nature through this like neural network, and this you know the Navi put their hair into the horse's hair, and they're connected there, but they're all connected to this tree, and the um, it trivializes all notions of um, kinship and of relationality, and which are not simplistic, and they're not um, as frankly silly as plugging your hair into a horse's tail. But the idea of relationality, and the idea that, in particular, when native people go out to fight for the water, and to fight for the land, and to um, to fight for communities, that we are literally fighting for all living beings. And it trivializes that. It makes it into something that can be romanticized when it's not romantic at all. And Mel, when you were talking about, um, the militarization, and how when the um, Resource Development Agency, aka the US military, is out there trying to bomb the heck out of Pandora in order to extract. And this is where it to me is also so, like, utterly stupid. He calls the mineral unobtainium. Like, Could you think of something a little more interesting? Unobtainium. Okay, whatever. But it was like Apocalypse Pandora. I mean, watching those helicopters, because that was also my generation, was that you know that um, the really hard films about Vietnam that were coming out in the 70s. And seeing those helicopters reminded me of like Apocalypse Now. It reminded me of Deer Hunter, all of that. And so I'm watching these and I'm going, motherfucker, like, yeah, these are like, that's all I can say about these films. This is literally the same thing as that first US war, the first televised war, which was Vietnam. And so we have the juxtaposition of the good settlers who are taking on the skin of the Na'vi and becoming the Na'vi. And then we have the militarized folks who are just there in the extractive industries. But they also have their beings that they become. They get into these suits and they tramp around. So you have, I mean, it's so simplistic and it's so derivative, but it's also like it's a little kid's, toy dream that James Cameron has created. The settler colonial man's wet dream is to have these big suits stomping around, and then you know the good guys are all going native, but with technology. So it's all about technology, and it's all about how to use technology to get what you want. And yeah, it's
Well, I had forgotten in the first movie that Grace, who's played by Sigourney Weaver, she's a woman, right? And she reminds me a lot of like anthropologists and kind of the history of US settler colonialism because she's a scientist. She's an academic, right? She's like the foremost expert on, I think it was the ethnobotany of Pandora. And so she like started a school, like the precursor to what I imagine would be a boarding school. She's like teaching the young Navi kids English. She's like a friend to the Indians, right? She's like, that's the person that she is. She's like the kinder side of colonialism. And is highly gendered because she's like the only woman. Well, in the second one, the general is a woman. Edie Falco, I think, plays the general in the second, The Way of Water Avatar. And she's like hyper masculine because she's the face of like the military aggression and like the unadulterated conquest side, or like tactics, colonial tactics. But yeah, Sigourney Weaver, she plays like even though she's an avatar, right? So she dons the skin of the Na'vi. She's like the friend of the Indian. And so what that reminds me of, and I've researched a lot of this history in relationship to like 20th century colonial administration for my people, the Navajo. And like anthropologists they were agents of the state. They were literally paid by the state. Like the state, they ran multi-million dollar, incredibly like huge state-sponsored research projects that were specifically designed to create the conditions for Navajo people to enter into modernity. They were literally social experiments. And like these people wrote some of the most famous books on my people and the Navajo people. They trained fleets of PhD students who would go out and do their field work and write their dissertations in these field laboratories, amongst my people. I'm sure this is the same amongst others. And so the reason why I'm saying this is that it just was such a straightforward, and I don't think it was ironic, and actually I'm not even sure it was like a self-aware thing, because I don't think James Cameron is that intelligent. And I certainly don't think he cares about Native people at all, or like about a careful kind of analysis of colonialism and how he might portray that, like fictionally, right, in Avatar. But like I think it's just the common sense of colonialism is to think that like the anthropologist woman, or like the woman biologist, is the kinder side. And they even say in the movie that she's like the diplomat, and like this is like we'll do the diplomatic thing where you go and you be friends with them, you try to convince them to leave so that we can mine underneath their home tree, the tree of life or whatever it was they were living in. But if that doesn't work, we'll just go in and we'll just exterminate them anyway. right? And so I there's so much to say, I think, actually about the portrayal of colonialism in the movie that, again, I really don't think James Cameron sat down and read some books about the history of colonialism and was like, okay, I'm going to have like a very self-aware, smart commentary about this. He is just a colonizer motherfucker, right? And this is like so ingrained in who he is that this is why he wrote this story, because this is who he is, because he's like your average white dude American, honestly. And so, and it was such like, anyway, we can talk
Why
more about the
that's why people
colonialism.
ate it up. That you just answered for me like what Cena asked us, like, well, why do people eat it up? It's because he was not doing research to make a different movie, or he was not checking his lens. He was not checking his bias. He was not one of these like white people who are out here deconstructing whiteness and replacing lenses. Like, he is the embodiment of settler
Yes.
colonialism, just subconsciously, just spewing, just doing what it does. And that's why people eat it up, and that's why people loved it. And that like, and this also reminds me of the aspect of, like, Elena, you were talking about the technology piece. I talked to Justine briefly before this, and that's something that she said. She said all the technology and all the technological advancements that we see on Pandora, like, they're there for 30 years in the first one. So in 30 years, they've established the camps, done all the things, extracted the resources, and then they leave, they get kicked out, and then they come back. And there's a line in the second movie that says, like, oh, in 1 year, and then it's like, they show up, and then 1 year later, we don't get to see all the fucking cool action. Sorry, we don't get to see all the cool resistance. We don't get to see all the cool, like, the fighting. We are come towards the end where he's ready to, like, leave. But Justine was like, if all that technology is being used on Pandora, imagine, like, what Earth is like. And I find myself watching that too. Like, what is Earth like? The level of militarization and the company, the RDA, like, and this is where James Cameron, like, this is why that comment I think is so true about him recolonizing this movie, is because so much of the budget went into world building. Like, so he had teams of people crafting a world. If you go to the Avatar Wikipedia or the wiki page, every single plant you see in the movie that has a wiki page and has some sort of taxonomy, and people have committed, like, um and there's even a thorough history of the RDA, the main antagonist corporation. And according to the lore of the world, they have essentially, they're a weapons and a space exploration company. It's like the military industrial complex wrapped up into a corporation, and they
Right.
are like, they have enough power and they have enough influence that they essentially act as a government on Earth, right? And so when you think about them sending all these ventures back, um, one of the things that I found myself wondering during the second movie, I was like, why do they come back? I was like, why do they actually come back? Because we find out in the second movie there's a new unobtainium, and they don't call it like unagium or whatever, but they call it atrium, I think, or atrium. But it's essentially space whale fluid that allegedly stops the aging process for human beings. And instead of being like 20 billion for a kilo, like, a little vial is worth like 8 billion. So I guess it's just like, I wonder what's happening on Earth. Like, we open up with Jake Sully, vet. He's sitting in, like, essentially a cell, like a prison cell. Like, and as I was rereading this, like, a cup of coffee cost $12 on Earth, and, like, he got injured in the war. He was a Marine and the best of his class, but the government and will not pay for his spinal. Like, apparently, because if you there's a surgery he could have. Like, he doesn't have to be disabled, but the government doesn't do that. And that's the main driving force for him to go to Pandora. One, to, like, live out his brother's, wishes. He loses his twin brother. But he also, like, that's something that man, what's the jarhead's name? The name of that actor, I can't remember. Paul Stano, or I don't remember, but the
I don't
military
remember.
guy.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's what he dangles in front of him, is like, you could get your legs back with this. Like, we could have a surgery I don't know. It's just, it gets to the point where, like, I think that's why people eat it up, because it's easier for people to imagine going to space with this movie, going to space with Interstellar the following year, and then The Martian, and then Gravity. Like, it's easier for settlers to imagine never ending conquest, never ending
Yep.
colonialism, never ending expansion than it is to just like sit down, um, and like actually do the work to take care of this planet, do the work to undo some of the things that have been done. They would rather, make me wish I could see a plastic free ocean on a space planet that, isn't even real.
But look, we also look at what Cameron does. Like, we look, very famously, we did a critique of Dances with Wolves, and we talk a lot about the declension narrative and Costner, as John Dunbar going in there and becoming, the Indian. He becomes the Lakota, better Indian than the Indians. And then at the end of the film, as the words are scrolling across, the great horse culture of the plains passes into history. And this film has a different message, though. This film has a message, I think, that Cameron is setting himself up as the savior. So, in other words, the narrator as the savior. And so he is Jake Sully, he is Grace, because he is ultimately the great puppet master, where he is omniscient enough to realize that the Navi are protectors of the earth and protectors of the water. And in order to save Pandora, which has become sort of a stand in for Earth, what was done to the Earth and what was done to indigenous people all over the Earth, we're going to save the Navi. We're going to save Pandora. We're not going to let the extractive industries and the military take it over. So it's almost more disgusting and more awful that we're not us here, but people are consuming this and saying, "Oh yes, we've learned so much that now we're on the side of the Navi. We're on the side of Pandora." And it's like, yeah, you're really not. You're really not. And Mel, when you were talking about Grace as an anthropologist, I mean, so absolutely true. Like, everything from Margaret Mead to Elsie Clews Parsons among the Pueblo and Florence Holly Ellis, anthropologists, they actually have always encouraged women, because you do see women as someone who can be softer and more convincing of people. And they're the ones who you think have these maternal instincts that will help, when actually literally what they're doing is consuming, and then consuming, and then just letting people be genocided, and leading the way for people to be genocided, for boarding schools, for children to be taken away, whether by boarding schools or being adopted out of the tribe. And that's been something that's gone on in under the guise of academia, under the guise of anthropologists, for several hundred years. And it's a weird thing to see her in that she dies and then she comes back to life. So, like, how do you wrap your brain around that in this film?
And she's paid by the corporation, the ADR, whatever it's called, RDA. Yeah, that's such a poignant point, Levi, that it's a corporation, but it's essentially acting as a state or as a government. It is the military industrial complex wrapped up with resource extraction, one and the same. And like, a lot of anthropologists were paid by the state. I actually had to do this entire thing with my book, where I had to look into the history of contract anthropology or contract archaeology. And so contract archaeology is essentially the biggest branch of archaeology. Like, academic archaeology is actually not the most well-funded and largest branch of archaeology in the United States or like in the world. But essentially archaeologists are contracted by development corporations to essentially like salvage cultural heritage before extractive corporations or development corporations come in and completely destroy the land for a hydroelectric project or for coal or uranium mining. And so the only reason why I'm talking about this is that like that's such a straightforward narrative, right, that is offered within Avatar. And she just reminded me of a contract archaeologist. And most of those contract archaeologists historically have been women. And so, and most of the people who ran and taught students in schools were women in like federal boarding schools, right? And so there is this like gender dynamic to colonialism that plays out in the film that, again, like you said, Levi, is like the settler unconscious, but it is so on point. It is so on point with actually how colonialism plays out in these gendered ways and the way in which colonialism, the different arenas and technologies and tactics of how you get the job done, how you get the job done of eliminating a people, how you remove them. They even use the language in the movie, relocation. I was writing this stuff down. They're being relocated. They're talked about as hostiles. They're insurgents. Edie Falco's character in Way of Water, she talks about how what they're trying to do is tame the frontier and pacify the hostiles. And so there is such straightforwardly, it feels more like 19th century kind of U.S. colonial language and like imagery in the movie and in the war, kind of like the Indian War kind of sense that is like the hyper masculine kind of militarization of the film. But then there's a much more like 20th and 21st century feminized kind of anthropologist, friend of the Indian kind of narrative that's going on. And so I saw both of those things working very seamlessly together. And again, like not in a way where it was like trying to, again, be like self-aware. It wasn't like a critique of colonialism. It was like actually just like deeply disturbing, I think, to watch this and to know that there were like over both films, it's almost $1 billion spent on making these films. 2 films. If they're going to be 5, it's going to be several billions of dollars at this point, right?
A quarter of a
Like,
billion is what it's estimated. Anywhere from half to almost a quarter billion at this point estimated.
okay. And so here you have like an enormous amount of resources that are going into what we're supposed to think is like a fictional interpretation of like space colonization. And I'm like, you're spending $500 million literally just like telling the entire history of genocide against like native people, whether it's in the United States or like the history of like European imperialism, right? And like the millions of indigenous people in like the tricontinental that were murdered, you know, and displaced because of that project. And and then you're doing this in such a way so that you're attracting children to like watch this and to identify with it. Because the second movie, the way like the dialogue amongst the Jake and what's her name? The woman he marries, Natiri, Jake and Natiri's kids, they're just talking like a couple of like shit kid Americans. I guess they learned how to talk from Jake like that. And it was so geared towards children, like white American children. It was so obvious. And I'm
The
like,
amount
you're
of
just
bros and
indoctrinating.
cousins. Yeah, the amount of
Yes.
bros and cousins. It was so cringy. It's just like,
So cringy.
and that's a part of the language where at the beginning of the second one, he says the language was tough at first. He's like, but now when I hear it, it might as well as be in English in my head. And I had a big point on that where it's like, we're not only we're watching, and there's like the transition. So they have the subtitles at the bottom of the screen, and then as he's narrating that line, they go from speaking this actual a real language they developed. Like this is on par with like Elvish in Lord of the Rings and Klingon and Star Trek, where they developed an actual like using glottal stops, intonations, nasal. Like they developed a full uh dialogue that we now hear just in English, and we're hearing it in English. So one of the things that I was thinking, I was like, so we're hearing not only these kids think and having this representation of like English and English words to identify a Western audience, but it's very explicitly language. Like he's a Marine, he's carrying the language of empire, he's carrying the language of
Yes.
imperialism, and that's translated through this insurgency. And when it comes to like, and I'm not gonna lie, when I was watching the second Avatar, Way of the Water, I had watched the first part um for like 45 minutes. I think sometime over the last year or two, I was like, all right, I'm gonna see if I can do it. I got 45 minutes in, and I was like, I can't do it. So I had to rewatch the first part twice, which is the worst part. Um, but then when it got to the part where they're hitting insurgencies, like when they're coming out of the water and stabbing people, and when they're like when that whale like crushes the boat, I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it got me. I was like, about time, like this is what I wanted to see. And it helps people have a settlers have an easier time identifying with an alien insurgency practicing asymmetrical warfare against a easier than they can identify with real life asymmetrical insurgents today. Like that's
Yeah.
happening in Palestine. That's happening all over. Anywhere people resist this type of imperialism, like ask James Cameron what his position is on this, and I guarantee it will not be reflected in the way that he's portraying like the Navi, like, and even like, oh, the Lakotas would have fought harder. And I had this conversation with my middle schoolers because I'm working with my middle schoolers right now, and they were really hard on each other, and we were talking about homophobia, and I had one student, very genuine, very, we had a vulnerable conversation. She's like, but if people are gay, then why or if being gay is, or no, they said, if why don't they just not be gay if they know it's going to lead to harm? And I said, why are they being harmed? I was like, why are we asking people who are oppressed or hurt by oppression and hurt by like just violence? Why are we asking them to change? Why are we not questioning that narrative of violence? Like, and so when I see them not only cheer, like, people in the audience, we sit through, like, I'm not gonna lie, I was tearing up when they were killing those whales. I was tearing up when he lost his son, and I was just like, it's easier to identify with some fictional resistance than it is to identify with real life ongoing resistance. And
Hell
that,
yes.
I don't know if there's a poetic justice to that, or if there's some sort of deeper, but that's what I noticed. That's what I was like, ah.
Well, it's also easy in that vein. I was going to say this earlier too, and I try not to cut you off, Elena. Go ahead and go after this brief comment, but it's also easier to imagine a completely fake world in space than it is to like imagine the end of capitalism here on Earth, right? Which is like what I'm assuming has caused, which we're like actually living in like this intense acceleration of like oligarchy, right? In the United States, you have Elon Musk actively trying to colonize space, and he's like running all this shit, in the federal government. And so how is it easier to like identify with blue cat people who aren't real, right? And their resistance or their struggles, or like, I don't know, they're like coitus, their little thingy coitus, all living things on the planet, than to like actually just be a good fucking human being here and to have real equality or have real solidarity with like the resistance of the oppressed, right? Against the conditions of their oppression that are caused by capitalism. And if Jake is, as you point out, is Levi is escaping kind of an Elysium, to talk about another science fiction movie that came out around that time, an Elysium type scenario on Earth, right? Then it's like, cool. Then once Elon Musk can actually build like high capacity space shuttles, then we can just like go into space and we can just like walk away, right? We can just walk away from the lumpen proletariat, the hyper racialized, right? The extreme surplus population that now inhabits the earth, because we ruined it, and now we have multi-billionaires and we have the extreme poor. And it's just like, it's insane. Yeah, I don't know. And I'm sure that the third, the fourth, and the fifth Avatar, I cannot believe there are going to be five of these fucking movies. They're going to reflect, like, politically what we are also experiencing right now. And it's going to be so disturbing. And it's not going to be a commentary or a critique on it. Again, it's going to be the settler and like the ruling class unconscious of like, this is the natural conclusion to everything that we've built.
They've destroyed the earth. They, as in these fictional people who the Earth has become uninhabitable, so they're going into space, which to me is always interesting that the space race is almost always populated with very wealthy, rich men. And the idea that the Earth is expendable, and they can just, phallically invade space and rebirth these colonies, just the settler colonialist wet dream. And Jake himself also, again, represents this in that he is reborn, as a Navi, because his body has been destroyed, and the men that have been instrumental in destroying the body, that is the people in the military, the men in the military, won't give him back his legs, but they'll give him a new body. And this idea of male birth is always, it's disturbing as hell, but it is one that comes out a lot in science fiction and always has, like literally since Star Trek. You have this idea of these men in the space race, wanting to go and recreate life on other planets, as they're incapable of giving life organically, naturally, as Earth beings. So they can do it in space. So the space race has always been very much founded on this masculine principle of male birth. And so you have this really evident in this film, but also the way they set up the Navi as being the protectors of Pandora is really viewing environmentalism itself through a Western lens. And so the idea that these are beings that want to protect their planet is a very one-dimensional view of what Indigenous activists do on a daily basis to protect their homes. And it's so one-dimensional as to be insulting to the amount of work that's gone in water protectors, land protectors, in the Amazon, the rainforest protectors. It is not just blue people with long hair who are 10 feet tall, protecting a tree. Like literally all life on this planet is dependent on water, on the rainforests, on having clean air. And the way they make it so simplistic, and looking at it through a Western lens, also, what are the benefits? Like, what can we extract from this versus what is it inherently to Indigenous people? And Cameron can't possibly understand that. So it's like a cartoon. It's like there's no substance to any of this. There's no critique. There's no, you said this, Mel. There's no critique. There's no self-awareness. There's just like this comic book characterization of these people on all fronts. The Navi, but also the RPA, the anthropology figure. And then you see from both movies, but in the first one in particular, you do have other women, and it's interesting who appears. Like Michelle Rodriguez is the helicopter pilot, and she's an oorah, whatever. Marine is what comes to mind, but whatever.
She always plays that character in every movie she's in.
Anytime you see Michelle Rodriguez, she's the rough and tough. She's the girl, but she's not like other girls because she works a wrench or flies a plane.
She's one of the men.
She's tougher than them, but she's got morals too, because
she does have morals, because she's a woman, and she's going to save them in the long run, because she's a woman. So there's
always sacrifice herself.
Very specific gender roles, and it's a caricature. This film, both films, they're just caricatures. And I didn't know there was going to be 5. And I'm
No,
almost
I just looked it up. There's allegedly going to be 7. There's
What?
we're
No,
we're gonna
Levi, no.
have we're gonna have a septuple. Yeah, it said because the first 5 are booked for 2028. I think is the one that I saw, and then there's allegedly going to be one in 2030 and 2032. So like
So one
we
for each
haven't.
continent.
Yo, yeah, it's just it's wild because the amount of world building, like, because I was, as you were reading about like the RDA, I googled the wiki for the RDA, and something that was kind of interesting about that was they mentioned that like the RDA is it's got a monopoly, and it was given they first colonized Mars, and it said, funny enough, it didn't start out, it started from modest beginnings. It started as a silicon tech startup founded out of a garage after they borrowed money from somebody. Like, this is all in the wiki, right? So they said that this company started as a Silicon Valley tech startup, very similar to like Bill Gates or whatever, but it was jump started by large donations from friends or family or whatever. And that the reason why, and also Earth is overpopulated, quote unquote, with 20 billion people. They said there's 20 billion people living on planet Earth, right? And I thought that was interesting when I was reading about like what is Earth happening, because that kind of pushes the narrative of overpopulation, this like racist, like just like it's not overpopulation, like that starts to lead the way for um like I remember when I was taking a class on I think it was environmental sociology class in my first 2 years, we were talking about like just kind of how harmful this idea of overpopulation is, that the people who really push this perspective of overpopulation will also simultaneously look to places um, as like it's almost like a precursor for an excuse to start like killing people, and a precursor for an excuse to like removing people, right? So Earth is 20 billion people, um, and their first mines that they started was on Mars and the asteroid belts in the solar system, which it says in the wiki somehow started contributing to toxic pollution and toxic rains that were happening on Earth, right? So you have these massive, like, there had to be, and I don't know if the wiki is fan or if it's like sourced from the material, because a large budget movies like this, a significant amount of the budget went into world building. And one of the critiques of Cameron, as I was doing research for this, was that there were several points throughout the film where they had come up with these ideas, come up with these world building ideas, and retconned and removed things because James Cameron had a story he wanted to tell. This is the story he wanted to tell, and he had full creative freedom. Or no, he didn't give his team full creative freedom. He did give it to them to create this world, to have the ideas, but when it came to like what goes into the movie, like it was his movie, right? Like, so everything really can be put and pointed, traced back to him,
To
you
him,
know.
yep.
Yeah, so yeah, but it's just, I lost my train of thought, but it was just it's, and also at some point too, can we talk about the aesthetic changes between the main character Jake Sully in the first one and the second one? Because this is something that I was wanting to talk about. Like, so in the first one, he, and here's the thing: the Na'vi, they have their own culture. The Omaticaya, it means blue flute people. So like there was they're supposed to be very musical. During the creation of the story, we were supposed to see them having work songs. We were supposed to see much more of their culture. They're master weavers as well. That's something that they don't mention a whole lot. They have these really intricate weaved patterns. And so we have this white guy who becomes a blue person who, in the first movie, he wakes up and, oh, like he's gonna be one of those people. Then the next time we see him for the trailers, the first thing I know, I'm like, why does this bro have dreads? Why does he have
Oh,
white dreads
yes.
on
Yes.
his character? I was like, if he were, first of all, his hair texture in the first film was not like, so the dreads that he has, from what I can tell after watching the movie, they look like natural form locks but they're like unkempt. So like they're like the most, but he can't get that with his hair texture. So my thing is like all the other characters embody this like very black or very African like
Yes.
hairstyles, like all these intricate braids
Yes.
and things like that. And I'm like, so if he's really one of the people, if these people are master weavers and they all have their hair braided and all of these things, why did they let bro run around looking like that? Like they did not. Why wouldn't they be braiding his hair? Why wouldn't they be doing that? Why would they be allowing him to be like that? And same goes for the little white kid in the second movie. Like
Yes.
he's
Can we
got the
talk
dreads
about that
too.
kid?
Yeah, I just I was like, and honestly, he was. It was hard to watch his character in the whole. I'm just like, this is so unnecessary. He was so that kid was so unnecessary. He did not have to be there. They retconned him, but what do you guys think about that? Because I'm like, they're trying to adopt. I don't know. It was gross. It was gross to see like, oh, now that he's truly indigenous, he has white braids or white locks, and he's I don't know. I have nothing. I'm getting mad.
No, I really feel it felt very like Get Out, to be honest. So like, right? So this is this is like apparently the mind of this is how James Cameron understands things. It's very telling. So you have this like very wealthy, powerful white guy in Hollywood, right? Who's interpreting all of this shit. This is the filter we need to understand this through. And I really feel like the Na'vi are incredibly racist stereotypes of two types of indigenous people. It's indigenous people, like North American indigenous people, primarily plains people, and then like African indigenous people. And so the jewelry, the hair, the physicality, right? Like we're supposed to understand them as like very strong. And it just reminded me of that scene in Get Out where the main character who's like trapped there, the black protagonist, he's seeing the black gardener running really fast, even though he's an older person. And he's just like, what is this? And you find out that these like white people have developed like this cult, right? Where they like suppress the souls and the identities of these like black folks that they lure in to this compound where they're at. And then they like inhabit their bodies because they really love like how fast they are. And this also really reminds me actually of like why white people really like watching football, because like the majority of the athletes in mainstream sports in the US are black. Can we just be honest, right? And so there's something and then they like try to embody that. They're like have such an affective attachment to like the physicality of blackness, and it's so gross. It's so gross. And so I think it's like that the physical kind of attributes of the Na'vi like are about that. They're like just profoundly anti-black. It's just profoundly anti-black. But then like the cultural and maybe like the political aspects of the Na'vi, I think are much more about like indigenous people of North America, like the tree hugger that Jake calls it, or right, like this like mystical connection, like you were talking about earlier, the supernatural connection that like indigenous people have with all living things and with the earth at a neurological level. Um, like even the language in some ways, and then like the politics of resistance, or the way that the Na'vi really resist their displacement and the destruction of the earth, very much just feels like 2016 No Dapple Water Protector to me in a lot of ways, at least in the second movie. And so I feel like those are the two intensely like anti-black and anti-Indian archetypes that are being operationalized in like the Na'vi, how they look, how they act, how they speak, how they, the things that they care about, how they relate to each other and the colonizers. And that's not surprising. It's so disgusting that it's like two steps removed, because it's like blue cat people and it's supposed to be like science fiction. This is supposed to be like a fake planet, right? But I'm just like, you're literally just engaging in white supremacy. Like, that's all you're doing. That's all you're doing.
The first time I saw the movie, I remember thinking the Navi present like Maasai, because the tall, the skinny, the way they move. And then as the story went on, of course, I got the same feeling, that oh no, these are definitely indigenous. people from North America. But then you get into, and that was the first movie. Then you get into the Way of Water. You're talking about a lot of you could be talking about Kanaka Maoli, you could be talking about Oceania, you could be talking about Amazonia. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, it's just an amalgamation. He just like throws. He just takes a giant, hunk of whatever and throws it up against the wall and sees what sticks, and that's what he uses. So there's nothing really specific about any particular indigenous group, but there are things that come out of it. There are things that are presented, and yeah, it's all very, very weird and very like acid trippy.
Well, this is where like the identity politics of like indigenous representation or whatever representation are really weaponized, because we have we have this very visual like character change from Jake in the first movie to Jake in the second movie. And then we also have, in the first movie, they were meant to be an alien culture, there was real emphasis to not emulate any single culture, right? They're like, we're going to put all this work into trying to make it so that it's never before seen, and that you can't really pick. Like, that was the effort for the first movie. But in the second movie, yeah, they lean heavy into Pacific Island indigenous culture, particularly Maori. Like a lot of the tattoos on the whales. Like, there's a scene where they're discussing something, and all the fish people, I can't remember what they're called. I think they're called Metakaya. Metakaya are the water people, but they're sticking their tongues out and they're doing the Haka faces as they talk, like, and as their like expressions of, like, so like the tree people, they like hiss, they're kind of like hissing like cats. um and so I guess and this kind of reminds me of like anytime in video games, like, and because I'm a gamer, I like video games, I'll do that. But there's a real move to include indigenous motifs in characters. So like there's a bunch of video games, RPGs and things where you create your character and you get to customize them, right? That's part of the fun for creating like a character in role playing or a Dungeons and Dragons type game. And they're including a lot of like tattoos. So back in the day when you would pick a video game, you'd get like one or two tattoo choices. You'd get like the skull and bones on a character, or you'd get like the tribal, like Hawaiian, or maybe like a Celtic type tattoo. And then now they're incorporating even Maori like designs or Coast Salish designs, like Haida, Tlingit Haida form line, and people, and it's all in the name of like inclusion and representation, right? So people tend to think that, oh, we're going to feel included because we see physical representations of our communities, whether that's the pandering of like making Jake Sully look like with his locks, or the putting the artwork on a whale or something like that. But it's like, that's a totally different conversation when it's this rich white guy who has all the resources to do it, and like, you see that, and maybe you're young and uninformed or uneducated, and you're like, oh wow, that's really cool. But when you think about it, they're stealing like they have always done, and it's just making it very uh it's just making it I have concerns that, and I know we talk about like identity politics, and we're on this page and channel, like we are very critical, and just like we see it for what it is. Um, but that's some of my biggest concerns in these next, it's just like, I'm not gonna lie, when I saw that Donald Trump had won, I had like a small breath, because I was like, what if Kamala Harris wins and everybody just like, it's just like, it's over, because we have a black woman who is commander in chief now, and it doesn't matter, like, I just couldn't stand like the liberal facade of it anymore. I would much rather, and people are always like, well, pick your enemies. It's like, honestly, like, I would rather go against bold-faced fascists than sly, like, corner of their mouth liberals. Like, any day, like, at least they let you know who they are. At least they let you know their positionality. They're not trying to be your friend, right? And there's a level of just like, I just feel like this movie embodies that liberal, like, kind of representation politics, or that liberal like sensibilities. Um, it's just, yeah, it's really it's a trip. I was kind of upset when I saw how, like, I felt like they were getting lazy. Like, to me, the Medicaya, they were obviously Maori, like with the tattoos, with the things that they put on the whales, like with the, especially when I saw them sticking their tongue out as they were like talking, I was just like, oh, I was like, wow, I was like, so they're not doing that anymore. They're not trying to create something original, quote unquote, or unrecognizable. Like, they're just bland face, stealing now. Um, and we'll see what the next one is, but hot dog.
I I watched Avatar: Way of Water on Prime Video. I guess it's also available on Disney Plus. But I was on my iPad for part of it because I was like watching it while I was doing other things because there's no fucking way I was just gonna sit down and watch this whole thing without anything else. And I guess Amazon Prime, if you because I had to pause it a lot, it has all of these like factoids you can have. It appears like on the left-hand side of the screen. And at one point, there was this factoid about Kate Winslet performing the Haka because she plays the medicine woman of the Maori-esque tribe. Yeah. And I did not click on that because just the snippet, and it was like a partial snippet. So I'm actually going to try to find if there's an article. But now that you're saying, like, obviously that was just like a ripoff of like Maori. Yeah, no. So you have also Kate Winslet, who is like apparently James Cameron's darling, probably since the time that they made Titanic together, but who's this like venerated, like award-winning, like one of the most prestigious white female actors in like the history of film, like in the history of film. And here she's like playing Indian too. And she and like James Cameron get to reunite, you know, 10, 25 years later. Yeah, because she was in Titanic. Yes, that was her. Yeah, she was the main character. She was Rose in Titanic. Yes. And so it's like she's part of the wet dream too. It's like these two greats of like the history of cinema come back together. And the way that they like form their creepy kinship again and like spend lots of money is through like playing Indian and like engaging like racist portrayal of indigenous people. Anyway, I'm gonna try to find the actual citation for that.
Cena was asking if we wanted snippets or what for the clip. So can we get Kate Winslet doing the
Performing the Haka?
as the snippet? That's insane.
I'm looking it up. I'm looking it up right now.
Wow.
Well, it's interesting. When I first kind of fell in love with New Zealand, I didn't really appreciate the indigenous culture there, the Maori culture, but it embedded itself somehow because I found when I was writing Avatar, I went to New Zealand the first time in '94. When I was writing Avatar in '95, the first treatment that later became the screenplay, I wound up putting in a lot of sort of Polynesian sounds into the naming structures of family names and place names and things like that, and I was obviously subconsciously influenced, I think, by Maori culture. And then as I went back to New Zealand to make Avatar the movie, when I went back there 10 years later, essentially, I started to learn more about Maori culture, and there were a number of Maori actors and stunt people that worked on the film, and so I kind of learned more about them as a people and their culture, and so now it's become a kind of closed feedback loop where I allow Maori culture without hopefully going across the line to cultural appropriation, but I allow it to subconsciously invade some of my thinking as I'm writing the Avatar sequels. I mean, I don't think you just go in and you grab from different cultures as a writer. I think you have to be respectful. But for example, I'd like to include a Haka in one of the Avatar films, and before I do that, I'll go to the iwi in the Wellington area where we'd be shooting and asked for their permission and support to do that. I have already done that in the past. We were going to include a Haka in the first Avatar, but it wound up getting cut out for length. We even did the performance capture on it. But I find that all very fascinating, and the Avatar films are a celebration of indigenous culture, not just Maori, obviously, but cultures in South and Central America, Africa, the Plains Indians, the Native Americans, First Nations people in Canada. It's all kind of rolled in. You try to find common themes that will resonate with indigenous societies everywhere. That's kind of what Avatar is. By putting it on another planet, you kind of make it not anybody but everybody, you know, which is something that fantasy and science fiction can do.
I don't know. That could push me over the edge, seeing her performing a Haka. But then look at Sigourney Weaver. I mean, she went from killing aliens, like being a badass with a giant space submachine gun, killing aliens, to making friends with aliens and being an alien. I mean, it's very disturbing.
Speaking of Sigourney Weaver, the immaculate conception of her character, like she was so Indian that somehow, and this is also, I also want to, this brings me, but she was so Indian that she gets to be reincarnated as a Navi, right?
Yeah.
Um, but my question was also like, so the plot point of them sending, and this is kind of like a movie's cliche, the same be same. Like you watch a big fight, or you have this big complex war, and this resistance, everyone joins, but then it's just like Jake and the Colonel knife fight, same v same fight at the end. It happens all the time in movies where you have like the same. But I'm just like, their whole guise of coming in as Navi was one quick dialogue, which was from the general or whatever, that one character, where she said, "Hopefully, you won't trigger the planet's immune response," right? And so
Huh.
and so that's why they went in, right? Because apparently, and which they spent no time in the movie talking about. Like, excuse me, like an immune response? Like, you're telling me that this planet has an immune response to foreign, like, peoples, right? And it's supposed to be not, according to Grace, it's not just intelligence, it's utter consciousness and awareness, right? You're telling me that this mystical connection and this powerful, uh, force cannot detect, like, and also in the first movie, Awa came and fought. Like, the whole thing was like, oh, well, Awa's peaceful, and we have this like native kind of racist, like that natives are passive. Especially with the Tolkien, they said, oh, well, the Tolkien don't fight because they said that one murder leads to more murders, no matter how justified. And there's this language of passivity that is sprinkled throughout the film. And so you're telling me that Awa is been invaded once for 30 years, and then they come in and they blast like all the reefs, like they destroy, like there's that opening scene of the ships landing and it's destroying all. You're telling me that didn't trigger an immune response? You're telling me just because they have, and they know they're different because they have 5 fingers, they don't have the four like the Navi. You're telling me that they didn't trigger an immune response and that Awa isn't ready to throw hands? I'm like, that's not indigenous. I'm like, you telling me Awa is like this mystical indigenous woman who's like protecting all life and keeps the balance and things like that, but she wouldn't throw hands whenever like these known violent colonizers and plunderers and looters and rapists are coming back? I was like, that's a big. I'm like, this is why we should have, like, where's our money, James Cameron? Like, god damn. Like, I'm Lakota. Like, we're ready to fight back. Like, if that's how you feel, like, help, James Cameron. Like, like, it's so fucked up.
But also they feminize, the whole planet is feminized because so Pandora is a moon, like she's not a planet, right? So Pandora is a living moon. So already that's feminized. And then you do get the gender specific. Awa is female. Awa is feminized. So the passivity comes from this idea that women are more passive and women are not going to fight back. And that's also one of Cameron's majorly, fucked up um, characterizations. And that's why he's got Sigourney Weaver. And that's why he's got Michelle Rodriguez, who ultimately goes from being a warrior, because goes from being a warrior to being soft and helping and being kind and loving, because that's his view of the characters. Like, the men are the fighters. The men, epitomize this warrior image. and even Natiri, she starts out as a warrior. When she meets Jake for the first time, she's almost tries to kill him. So she is a protector, she is a warrior, but then she has children in the second one, and she all of a sudden is no longer a warrior. So there's some very, yeah, yeah. Natiri.
Danya's character,
Oh,
Nechiri.
they are noticeably absent in the second one.
Yeah.
Both the whole time we're following the kids a whole bunch, and I'm like, okay, this is cool. We get to explore this through this new set of characters, but like I'm much more interested in the politics of what Jake and all of them are doing, because the center the plot of the movie drives around their kids and like the trouble or the diplomat, like a huge diplomatic incident happened when they left his youngest or his middle no his youngest boy out there, and then he comes back with a friend or whatever. But the whole time, especially during the battle scene, whenever they battle at the very end when with the sinking ship, like James Cameron loves his sinking ships shots, Titanic, and then also in this second Way of Water, he's like a return to form with Kate Winslet. Like, what the fuck? But where did those people go? Like, because there was a whole, I just remember like the eclipse happened, and then we only followed the Sullys. And the whole time I'm thinking, I'm like, where are all these other people? Like, why are they not helping them? Like, apparently they just abandoned them and just let them be. But then, like, after they came back, they're like, oh, you're one of us now. Like, your son rests with our ancestors, so that means you're us now. And for the second time, Jake Sully is now double Indian, because he's not only Hunkad into Omaticaya, but now he's Matakaya, and he's collecting tribal IDs out here. He's getting his card
Yes.
punched everywhere he goes, and he's gonna show how he is the most Indian to ever Indian, and he teaches us how to fight, and he teaches us how to, I'm just like,
Exactly.
I'm just, I'm just like, what?